Who really paid for Trump's trade war? The hidden cost of tariffs on American wallets. When current President Donald Trump ignited a global trade war in 2018 with sweeping tariffs on imports from China, Canada, Mexico, and beyond. He promised a revitalization of American industry, a rebalancing of trade deficits, and a financial reckoning for countries he believed were taking advantage of U.S. markets. Trade wars are good and easy to win, he famously declared. But several years and billions of dollars in import duties later, the verdict is in, and it's the American consumer, not foreign nations or multinational corporations, who ultimately footed the bill. Let's begin with the basic premise. A tariff is essentially a tax placed on imported goods. Governments often use tariffs to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, to raise revenue, or as a political tool in trade disputes. When the Trump administration imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars in goods, especially Chinese electronics, Canadian aluminum, and Mexican auto parts, the stated goal was to punish unfair trade practices and boost U.S. manufacturing. But tariffs don't exist in a vacuum. They're paid at the point of entry by importers, the companies bringing in foreign goods. These importers aren't generous enough to eat that cost. They simply pass it down the line to retailers, to manufacturers, and ultimately to consumers. This is where theory and reality split. While the policy may have been marketed as a strike against foreign producers, it functioned as a tax on American businesses and households. According to a 2019 study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the average U.S. household paid an extra $44 per year due to the tariffs imposed on Chinese goods alone. That number sounds small, but it adds up quickly, and it only accounts for one set of tariffs. As new rounds were imposed and supply chains adjusted, costs climbed, and those burdens were anything but temporary. One of the most immediate effects of the tariffs was price increases across a wide range of consumer products. Washing machines, refrigerators, bicycles, furniture, and electronics saw noticeable cost spikes. For low-margin industries like apparel and consumer electronics, even a 10 to 15% increase in import costs could make the difference between profitability and bankruptcy. Retailers either had to raise prices or find cheaper substitutes, often lower quality goods or suppliers in less efficient countries. Some importers tried to absorb the additional cost at first, but that strategy proved unsustainable. When profit margins eroded, layoffs and closures followed. Small and medium-sized businesses, particularly those without large cash reserves, were disproportionately affected. Larger corporations had more leverage to negotiate new supply contracts or automate operations, but smaller companies were often left behind or forced to merge with competitors, contributing to market consolidation and fewer options for consumers. A macroeconomic scale, this created reduced retail sales, dampened consumer confidence, and lower overall economic growth. Tariffs didn't just make goods more expensive. They fundamentally altered how companies structured their operations, leading to hiring freezes, stalled investment, and business closures. Of course, the trade war didn't happen in isolation. Countries on the receiving end of Trump's tariffs hit back. China, the EU, Canada, and others imposed retaliatory tariffs on American exports, particularly targeting politically sensitive industries like agriculture, whiskey, and industrial manufacturing. In the EU, tariffs are typically factored into the value-added tax (VAT) system, which makes the cost more transparent to consumers. That visibility helps spread the burden more evenly, but does little to reduce it. Instead, European consumers still pay higher prices for US imports, and American companies lose access to lucrative foreign markets. In China, the strategy was different. The Chinese government used subsidies and currency devaluation to keep exports competitive even while absorbing some of the costs internally. This hurt Chinese producers in the short term, but allowed them to maintain market share. Over time, however, even Chinese consumers felt the impact through slower wage growth and weakened purchasing power. The end result? No one won. American farmers lost export contracts, Chinese manufacturers lost margins, consumers on both sides paid more, and global trade became more volatile. Perhaps the most significant and long-lasting consequence of Trump's trade war was its contribution to inflation and supply chain instability. The pandemic certainly made things worse, but the groundwork for the current inflation crisis was laid in part by disrupted supply chains caused by the tariffs. As import costs rose, so did final consumer prices. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that every 10% increase in tariffs on consumer goods added roughly 0.4% to core inflation in the United States. For a country already battling high costs of living, this additional burden made household budgets even tighter. Companies reacted by shifting their sourcing away from China to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. In fact, US imports from Vietnam rose over 40% between 2018 and 2023, largely to circumvent tariffs on Chinese goods. But rerouting supply chains is expensive, time-consuming, and often leads to quality and logistical issues. This transition period left gaps in inventory, product delays, and higher operational costs, all of which trickled down to consumers. And the idea that tariffs would spark a manufacturing renaissance in America, that too has failed to materialize. While some companies announced plans to reshore operations, many quickly realized that domestic manufacturing still relies heavily on imported parts, raw materials, and machinery. Tariffs didn't create new American jobs. They raised the cost of doing business at every step. One of the more popular defenses of tariffs is the call to buy American. Supporters argue that tariffs will encourage consumers to choose US-made products and incentivize companies to bring production home. But this oversimplifies a complex global economy. Even products labeled "Made in the USA" are often constructed from foreign components. Steel from Brazil, microchips from Taiwan, plastics from China. Attempting to isolate the American supply chain would not only be prohibitively expensive, but also drastically reduce the variety and availability of consumer goods. Off-season produce would vanish from grocery stores, electronics would skyrocket in price, retail shelves would become seasonal, regional, and increasingly barren. In truth, there's no going back to a 19th century economic model. The modern American economy thrives on global trade. Tariffs disrupt that flow and do little to encourage meaningful domestic investment. So who really paid for Trump's trade war? The data paints a clear picture. Importers passed costs down to wholesalers. Wholesalers passed costs to retailers. Retailers passed them to you, the consumer. Whether you were buying a refrigerator, a car part, or a piece of furniture, the final price you paid included a tariff you never saw listed. It was built into the sticker price, absorbed without acknowledgement, and replicated across millions of transactions every day. This hidden tax hit lower and middle-income households the hardest. Wealthier families could absorb the price increases or defer major purchases. But for families already stretched thin, even modest increases in grocery, clothing, or home repair costs had a significant impact. Moreover, tariffs compounded other inflationary pressures. As the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation, borrowing costs increased for mortgages, car loans, and credit cards, creating a 1-2 punch for consumers. The Trump administration's trade war was launched under the premise of fairness and economic strength, but in reality, it functioned as a regressive tax, undermining the very consumers it purported to protect. Tariffs didn't force China to change its practices, they didn't rejuvenate American manufacturing. Instead, they raised costs, profits, stifled innovation, and contributed to economic instability. Let us know in the comments, did you feel the effects of the trade war in your daily spending? Do you think tariffs can ever be a successful economic tool, or are they destined to backfire? Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more breakdowns on how policy decisions impact your wallet and what to watch for next.